Hi, this is Carrie Stevens. I'm at the University of Texas in Austin, and I'm here today to share with you some research that my research team and I did about how organizations have to communicate through technologies during emergency notification systems. So I have always been fascinated with the concept of redundancy. I still remember being a small child and having people ask me to do the same task multiple times. And yes, that was annoying. However, quite often their persuasive strategies eventually worked. Well, I think that those memories have kind of found their way into my research because I'm always interested in how we can reach people with messages. Quite often it has to be redundant, but not tick them off in the process. So the reason why I think it needs to be redundant today is that increasingly we're being hit with so many different messages through mobile devices, through desktop computers. We have lots of different communication channels. And so the challenge for organizations is when they have a real emergency, something really important to communicate to people, they need to be able to reach us. Therefore, redundant communication takes on a new level of importance because we need to communicate redundantly, but we certainly don't want to overload people in the process. So let me share with you just a little bit of background about this study, because I had originally created a grant proposal to study redundant communication in 3 different contexts, emergency response being one of them. It was not funded. However, about 2 years ago, an emergency happened where I remembered that I had the study designed, and we were able to launch this study very quickly because it was pre-designed ahead of time. So what we did is we actually surveyed the campus-wide members of a large university and asked about how they were notified about a campus-wide emergency. In this case, it was a shelter-in-place situation where they wanted people to stay where they were on that campus when the emergency was taking place. So then let me share with you some of what we found in our study. There were really 3 main findings. The first one is that whenever our study participants were notified about this particular emergency, after 3 notifications, it didn't matter what communication technology was used or which source, their sense of urgency was right about the same. However, before they received that 3rd notification, there were definitely some differences. So that leads me to the second main finding, and that is this notion of synchronous communication heightening their urgency more rapidly than asynchronous communication. So for example, in person or on the phone raises people's sense of urgency much more quickly if they were notified that way than if they received a text or an email. So the 3rd main finding really starts to get at a notion of what's called habituation. And let me explain that a little bit. Essentially, when people are exposed to the same stimulus over time, they start to not notice it, not pay much attention to it. We saw some evidence that habituation happened in this particular situation, but I think that, as I'm going to explain later, the notion of redundancy helps us understand how to overcome habituation. So what we found that happened is that the lowest sense of urgency for the first notification happened when people received a text message from the official university source. They sensed the lowest sense of urgency right then and there. However, that makes sense because at this particular university, they've done a really good job of initiating training programs and teaching people through these monthly tests using text messaging. So really what this means, if we take all these findings together, I believe, is that when we're in an actual emergency, we need to use redundant communication. Because once we sent 3 messages, it didn't matter how people received their notifications, their sense of urgency was the same. In a test, we only send 1 notification. So as long as we keep that difference, I think that's a way to kind of capitalize on being redundant. And by the way, in our study, being redundant actually did not overload people any more than like we had actually originally expected in the study. So let me share two kind of key takeaways from this study that I think people can embrace and possibly do additional research on. The first key takeaway is a notion of something that we see in the IT research called BYOD, or bring your own device to work. So increasingly what's happening is organizations are not providing us with mobile devices, people are providing their own. Well, in an emergency, that puts an organization in an interesting dilemma because they have to actually ask permission to send us messages through our personally owned mobile devices. This is something that communication scholars have really only started to consider, and I think it offers us a lot of opportunities in the future for research. The final key takeaway is what we're calling in the paper the go-tell message strategy. And we want to do that in a synchronous way. So when there is an emergency, if we can go tell someone in person about the emergency or pick up the phone and call them, we will raise their sense of urgency more quickly than if we use asynchronous communication channels. So thank you so much. I really would encourage you to take a look at our research and read our research paper. We're doing some additional research in this specific area, and we enjoyed putting it together and hope you find it beneficial. Thank you so much for your time.